Hi folks, welcome back. So far in Lefebvre's History of Cities, we've talked about the initial 0 point, its emergence into the political city when raw power first expresses itself, how that political city created conditions through its need for trade, for the rise of the merchant class, which created a new city centered around markets and the need for resale, and that mercantile city also created conditions for the emergence of the industrial city through its creation of opportunities for merchants to coordinate the production of the mass production of goods. And that somewhere in that transition, we get the transition from a predominantly agrarian society in which cities floated as islands amidst an ocean of rural, and shifted into a world in which the countryside became just the environment of the city, and that the two together became unified under the nation state. In this video, I'm going to talk about the industrial city. And here is an example of the quintessential industrial city that emerged at the time, Manchester, England, the originating home of mass production and factory production, a center of an object of theorization by Marx and Engels, as well as other people like Owen and others. And so we want to now discuss the emergence of the industrial cities, and it's kind of peculiar, right? Because in a sense, there is nothing that ties industry to cities. In fact, industry initially took place near the source of natural resources or natural sources of power. That is manufacturing, and by this we mean a sort of mass production kind of factory-oriented organization of production would take place near like a mill or something like this. A clothing mill, cloth mill, would be located near a coal deposit, so that it would be easy to utilize the coal to produce the energy it needed, or it would be located next to a stream or a river, so that it could use the flowing water to power looms and what have you. This explains some of the early American mill towns. But as technological development moved forward with the advance of the steam engine and larger and more powerful steam engines, and railroads, industry became mobile, right? Because once you could move power, you could move coal from the mines to anywhere else, then industry no longer had to locate near the coal. And it could make its decisions on the basis of a multitude of other factors. And that is, again, just like the merchants in relation to the nobles of the political city, the industrialists and industrial capitalists were more mobile than the mercantile class, which had anchored itself in the commercial cities, in the mercantile cities. However, despite this freedom of mobility, factories did indeed gradually but surely migrate into the city centers. And it did so in search of at least three things. First, it was in search of capital and capitalists, right? It needed money to get going. It also came in search of markets. So by locating close to a population that would consume its goods, it was cheaper and more profitable to produce in those places because they don't have to transport it. And third, they came to the cities in search of an abundant supply of low-cost labor, right, to minimize their costs. That is, they came to the cities for investment capital, for access to markets, and for access to cheap labor. And during this time, there was quite a bit of cheap labor because the state, the nobles, had, in particular, had begun to pursue what in the UK was called the enclosure movement, in which peasants were kicked off of their land. As nobles shifted their production from crops to sheep to produce the wool that would feed the factories that you see down there to make woolen clothing. They didn't need as many farmers to farm the land. And they discovered that it was more profitable to alienate the peasants from the land and simply pay them wages for farming or of some sort. Sharecropping. Excuse me. Either through sharecropping or just simply through wage work. And so these peasants being kicked off of the land had nowhere to go but to these cities and to seek work. And because there were so many people searching for work, wages were literally survival wages. People could barely survive at the time. Life expectancy in Manchester in the mid-1800s was not a lot higher than 40 or 45 years, right? Which would mean I would be a completely old man by mid-1800s Manchester standards. So I'm kind of glad I'm not living back then. And as the industrial interests moved into the cities, they remade those cities in their interest, right? And they did that. You would see this by the construction of railroad yards, the elimination of city walls, and clearly, as you can see in this picture, the creation of the construction of factories right in the middle of the city, and the adjoining slum tenements that would house the workers, right? So the city itself begins to take on new form centered around the factory. And residential districts would take on a whole new character to fit those needs, etc., etc. Of course, the industrial city and its newly emerging powerful interests was resisted by the political and the mercantile city through corporatism, right? That is, the earlier forms of power would come together by forming more personal relationships that would create monopolies, or tried to create monopolies that would control production and markets and the city. So you get the emergence, the long emergence of things like guilds, and other sorts of associations. But one thing I'd like to mention at this point is that, again, throughout this history of Lefebvre's, it's not that the political city ever goes away. It's just that the forms of power in the political city become weaker vis-a-vis the mercantile city. And so the mercantile city reshapes the world in its interests. And then as the industrialists become stronger and accrue more capital, they assert themselves vis-a-vis the merchants and take control. But we still have markets. We still have political institutions in these cities. It's just that those institutions are much weaker vis-a-vis the industrial city and tend to be subservient to the needs and interests of the industrial powers. So that is that the political leaders will pursue the interests of the industrial elite, and as I'll explain in a minute, even commerce itself becomes subservient to industrial interests. And that is because with the advent of mass production in industrial cities, the success of that increase in mass production builds the power of the industrialists vis-a-vis the others, and its success generalizes exchange. That is, it generalizes capitalist relations in society and leads to a shift to what Polanyi calls a market society. And I'm going to discuss that in the next video.